All right. Hey, everybody. This is a very special version of our blog, Down with Brown. We're going to do it as a podcast of sorts.
And who are you?
They don't need to know who I am.
They do.
It's Down with Brown. They're going to see my face. Anyway, hi, I'm Anita, one of the two co-writers of the blog, along with Adriana and Anita. And today we wanted to do this special episode, our blog post as a podcast episode, because we really wanted to talk about what's been happening at Carleton. And there's been a lot happening at Carleton, and particularly in response to COVID and in response to George Floyd and the racial uprisings that have been happening in response to George Floyd's murder by the Minneapolis police. And one of the things that happened was that over 2,000 alums of Carleton signed an open letter to Carleton. And what Adriana and I really appreciate about the letter was that it asked Carleton to kind of think about a long-term plan to institute racial equity and anti-racist policies and practices and procedures at the school, as they very, brilliantly point out in their letter, right? We did that for climate change, right? It wasn't just like, oh, we're going to do this for a year and we've resolved climate change, right? It's like a long-term solution to a long-term problem. And so the alums kind of asked for the same kind of response from the college to racial equity issues. And we wanted to talk about the response to that letter from the alums from Carleton. And we really wanted to have a couple alums kind of talk with us and talk through this response, because it was not, to put it mildly, adequate, right? And we really wanted to kind of think through why it was inadequate. And I think a lot of the times on the blog, right, we try to critique things, but we also tried to say, hey, here's what could have been better, or here's sort of what would have been a response that was at least adequate, if not actually responsive in a way that would have been, I think, much more welcome. So today we're super lucky to have two alums with us. I'm gonna let them introduce themselves. So Ainsley, you wanna start us off?
Yeah, so my name is Ainsley LeSure. I'm class of 2005. I believe that we were the first big, sort of cohort of students of color back in, the early 2000s. Well, yeah, 2001. So I guess that was the turn of the 21st century, at the start of the 21st century, right? But yeah, and since Carleton, I went to graduate school. I'm a political theorist by training, and I'm a professor in the Africana Studies department at Brown now, just starting there. I was at Occidental before in the political science department. And just to give you some background, and I would want to say this too, my work, the book that I'm currently working on, is about racism, right? And so it's so interesting to sort of, and I helped write this letter to make this call, right? Because it's yeah. So I'm going to stop there, and then we can pick up from there.
Thank you. Halah?
Hey, so I'm Halah Mohammed, class of 14. I actually was the only one chosen my year for the Thomas J. Watson Fellowship. So right after Carleton, I traveled around the world interviewing rappers, poets, and storytellers about why they do what they do, and how you create community, and how do you allow that to be preserved through that art form. After that, I actually was a math teacher. I coached math teachers. I recruited for Fortune 500 companies, and now I'm an academic advisor. The root of all of that work being that I'm the type of person that can see a talent in someone, and so I like to help them elevate it. So as an academic advisor now, I advise to specifically business degree seeking students. And one of the biggest things for them is being able to get them to really turn from visionary to builder. So that's the work that I do. And oftentimes I'm having conversations about many forms of intersectionality and how they navigate the world and navigate working on their degrees.
Yeah. So before we get into the meat of the letter, I was hoping we could get a little bit into the timing of it, because y'all sent this to Carleton on Monday, August 12th, if I remember correctly?
10th.
10th. And by that afternoon, I think they posted their response. And there are some people who are going to think that that is an inherent good, that Carleton responded really quickly. I know I didn't experience it that way, and I was wondering how you all felt and why maybe the timing was so meaningful here.
Yeah. Wait, do you mind if I jump in, Ansley?
Go for it.
All right, cool. So I think it's important to contextualize a couple of things. Carleton was already aware that there were alumni who were already having conversations, right? That's where our letter stems from, is that we had an entire Zoom call that was extremely inadequate, to put it very nicely. And we were like, that's not enough. Your response to those 11 student demands was not enough. And we need to do better, because part of the issue is very structurally put, right? It's very rooted in your entire structure. So Carleton has been having conversations across the board, across different departments. Professors have been having conversations, alums have been having conversations. And so I think for me, what it looks like on the outset is that this response came in less than 24 hours, when really they had been working on this and having conversations for weeks before then, which I think is even more insult to injury, because I'm like, you've been working on this for this amount of time, and this is the response that we got back. But then also, you didn't really sit with it. You didn't digest it. I don't think anybody could really digest that letter in that short period of time, at least not in my opinion, which is why when we posted it and we told people, you can sign the letter up until September 9th, right? Keep sharing it, read it, take your time with it, right? When we initially put out our Zoom call with I forget how many alumni were on there. It's like over 100 alumni on that call, and faculty and some staff members, a good amount of representation. But when we had that call and we asked for signatures, it was a whole week, right? We gave an entire week. We gave you some space to sit with the information, and it just doesn't feel like Carleton took this new information and sat with it. And I feel like that's part of another trend that they have. And I'll get back to that later, but it's a sense of privileging the urgency over the process. And it's like, I'm not asking for you to be super urgent. I'm asking for you to be intentional with your process.
Yeah, I mean, it's really interesting. And the way the entire thing has unfolded is very interesting. I can see how one would read this letter and think, oh, they're addressing all the issues that are being raised, right? But the problem is that is the way they're diagnosing the problem, right? And so our letter, and so I want to like reiterate, like not only so there were 9 of us originally who wrote up the letter. Then we had a meeting with other alums, talked about it, got their feedback, revised the letter. My colleagues, the people who I wrote the letter with, got 2,000 people to sign this letter. Okay, so now we're not just talking about we crafted a message, we reconsidered it, we got people support, okay, to sign on to it, and now we're giving, and because we went through this process, the college did know about the letter, right? And then this is the response. Now, the letter we wrote was very intentional about articulating the problem from our vantage point, right? We weren't talking from the students' vantage point. They had already written their letter.
Right.
When we showed up for that call, the initial call, so it's because there were a group of alumni, I think like, who graduated rather recently, who tried to get a group of alumni together. And it was like right when, you know, cities around the country were burning, you know, right, because of the protests. So, and this was very proximate to Minnesota, you know, like in Minnesota. So we got on this call, and the thing that struck me and mind you, I am a scholar, like I know the racism scholarship, right? And I know that the word racism is a hotly contested terrain. It is highly peculiar that we see these schools using the word racism now to even describe the problems that they're having. The fact that the word racism is being used in mainstream media right now to describe the problems that we have in this country is weird, because we've been in this moment where people have been distancing them. I mean, like, since post-civil rights movement, right? There's been contestation over whether we can talk about, you know, the post-civil rights moment as racist because of the drastic shift in public opinion, okay? Like a white public opinion about whether they think, you know, Black folk or people of color are equal to them or not. And there's all this work that shows this drastic, you know, change. But like, it's hotly contested. You have scholars who say we shouldn't even use racism to talk about the word, the use of racial bias to talk about it, racial injustice. So we're like, but to use the word racism is to enter into a contestatory space, right? That you have to articulate and sort of get clear about what you mean when you say it.
Right. Can we use this moment right here, Ainsley, to actually go to the letter? Yes. Because I think in part, like, so one of the things I was fascinated in, and that Halah, you got at, is that this is one step in a long, like an unproductive kind of discussion, right? Yep. So it, like, you know, the parties have not quite been meeting. And y'all have tried really hard. And it's really important for Carleton to recognize that it's not even just like that it's the most recent students and alums right now, that alums have these long histories, that they're now seeing this as part of like, you know, this ongoing discussion with Carleton and attempt to shift the conversation and to demand some kind of change. So, and then your point about, you know, how racism is being used, but it's such a slippery term, Ainsley. I want to go right to the letter, to this part that I've highlighted. So can we let's do a little close reading of this paragraph.
Yes.
Who wants to read it?
I'll read it.
Okay.
As we think further about what it will take to dismantle institutionalized racism and transform Carleton into a college that lives up to our collective aspirations, we must address gaps in equity and justice on campus, gaps we are turning to with urgency and attention. As a first step, anti-racism training facilitated by non-Carleton personnel will be required of all faculty and staff this fall.
Okay. So I want to talk about, for me, the thing that jumps out right away, and I'm curious, you know, like how y'all feel about this, is this like big difference between dismantle institutionalized racism, which those of us who study racism know, institutionalized racism is a useful term to use because it's throughout the structure. And then the kind of discussion of gaps. Like, how does gaps in equity and justice on campus match with this kind of dismantle institutionalized racism language?
Right. No, I hear you completely, because it's a micro and a macro. You're telling me there's this macro thing happening, but you want to get fixated on the micro. How are we ever going to pull all of these roots out? What are we doing here? How are you not recognizing that there's a connection between the two of these, that these so-called microaggressions and the little microaggressions form that you have on campus is part of a larger discussion about the environment that's outside of Carleton that in itself, right, operates under a framework of white supremacy, operates under a framework of there are individuals who are considered not humane enough, who are not considered equal enough, right? And so it's like it's like, well, that's a weird, but I'm gonna use it anyway. But it's like recognizing that there's lice, right, going on, and you're just like, I'm gonna take this one little piece of lice out. How? Your whole head, the whole head. So you can't tell me you're ready to take on the entire infestation of lice when you only fixated with this little one that you got on the comb. You got to get the whole head. Yeah, no, I hear you completely with that. That was very frustrating for me too, because I was like, you're saying two different things.
What's the gaps? You know, okay. Like, even if we were to say, all right, what do you mean by gaps? There is no clear articulation of the problem from the college's perspective in this letter. And that's the problem. It's like we can go straight to the place where they actually use dismantle institutionalized racism, which is not clear what that means to them. Right. It's like they're using pretty language, okay? Yes. So we're going to co-opt this language and just use it to say that we're addressing the thing that these people are talking about, okay? There's no sort of like, okay, maybe the gaps are pointing to, you know, these more substantive things, but that's not typically how gaps is used when one, you know, sort of talks about a gap, okay? Number two, but let's even go farther up on this, like the opening paragraph.
Okay, let's go, let's do it.
It says, all members of the Carleton community deserve a welcoming and supportive environment, right? Like that's a really broad, vague statement, okay? It needs some clarity. Are you suggesting that the problem that's being raised in the alumni letter and the student letter is about students not feeling welcomed and supported? Why don't they feel welcome and supported, okay? Right. For far too long, we have not lived up to our aspirations to provide such an experience. What are your aspirations? It's like, this is like, if this were a paper, okay, there would be red marks on it saying explain fully all throughout, right? Can you provide me textual evidence? Can you give me some examples of what you're exactly talking about here? That's why this letter is empty. It's empty. But from an outsider looking in, right? Like it's using all the pretty language, right? Oh, they're responding, you know, but it's like they're not saying anything, right? You drop down to the second paragraph. As a first step to address racism and discrimination at Carleton. What's the problem of racism and discrimination at the college? The students articulated a list of things. The alumni letter articulated a list of things, okay? When we were writing our response back to this letter, when we were basically trying to lay out how messed up it was, or we didn't think it was we thought it was a horrible response. Correct. A D- at best. Where was I going with this? I was trying to reconstruct, you know, the argument. I was like, they're not even addressing some of the students' problems, you know? So I went back to the student letter, and then I found sort of like their action plans that they had also put up on the website, right? Mm-hmm. And they do this thing where it's like point by point, like they show like, you know, we're gonna do this and we're gonna do that. You know, we addressed it, did it, you know, kind of thing. And it finally clicked. Oh, the anti-racist training is a response to the students' concern about the way they've been treated by faculty. Mm-hmm. Like the way that they called out an economics sort of like professor who basically is trying to, I guess, probably get rid of some of the majors because they feel like they have too many majors. And so they're doing it in terms of ability or success in a class, which is unacceptable for a number of reasons. And those kinds of things should be addressed as policy issues, right? Like how professors should be relating to students, how they should be evaluating them, how they should think about, you know, getting resources for the department, et cetera. Not sort of like deciding the ability of students based upon sort of like these, arbitrary like academic performance measures, right? Like, of course you can use those as assessments, but to then use it to then chart the course for somebody, that's like, you know, these are things that like, certain norms and cultural practices around racism and white supremacy is very important to sort of use these terms precisely, right? Do this kind of work that the students are trying to articulate by pointing to an example, but are bigger than that example, right? And they're completely missing the intricacies of the problem that's being raised in that one example. And I automatically thought about instances that I remembered at Carleton that mirrored the same kinds of patterns. That's why we want a conversation so that we can get a better account of this sort of systemic issue, which unfolds over time and over space and intricate relationships, right, on campus, right? Because it's producing a structure, a world, a whole nexus of, you know, sort of like ways of being that we should be trying to intervene upon, right?
Yeah. And I think this is why like the language of the gap to me is so interesting, right? Like coming from education, it's always like the achievement gap or the opportunity gap. And it's like, I'm kind of thinking of them as like this wonderful building that is Carleton, and we have a few little gaps, so we're going to kind of like, you know, cement in like anti-racist training for a couple of, you know, years. We're going to cement in like a little bit of like scholarship for students of color, right? And I feel like what you're asking for is like, actually, let's get to the foundations. Let's like uproot the foundations of like the white supremacist like foundations of this institution, of all institutions, right? It's not just
right.
So I feel like that's like so it's interesting to me that they are thinking of it as like gaps, right? Because there are like these things that we can like short-term things we can sort of fill in and like just do, but we don't actually have to change like the larger structure, right? I mean, I think even with like the notions of like opportunity gap and achievement gap, part of what I think about is that, you know, what is it that we're building towards? And it's not actually to get students of color to be more like white students, right? Like that's not the educational system I want. Right? Like I want to think about what are the aspirations and freedom dreams of like folks of color. And that's what I want my institutions to be about. So it's not about like moving towards whiteness. It's actually about uprooting and like dismantling whiteness.
Right.
But so that's so fantastic. Both of, I mean, all of this, right? Because that is exactly what this letter is posing, right? Whiteness is still absolutely centered here. You know, the people who need to be better welcomed are all still outsiders. These outsiders are, you know, it's like Sarah Ahmed's work. They're made the problem site because they are the ones who have failed to kind of enter the institution and be absorbed into it in the right ways. And the institution isn't even really taking any good responsibility for what it means to actually shift the institution to make it, as Anita, as you were saying so beautifully, an institution that actually is for everyone. Not that it welcomes Black, Indigenous, and people of color now, but that like from the get-go, from the foundation. And I think this kind of like the use of the anti-racism training is the kind of one example they give is fascinating, right? Because it locates the problem in the faculty, but is also something that can be inoculated, right? Like, you know, that faculty, once they get this anti-racism training, don't you know, they're all going to be okay and fixed.
And once they have their own sort of individual transformation, that they get to police, that they don't have to be like, how do we know? You know, like it individualizes the entire, all the work that has to happen. Yeah. So yes, the institution sponsors this training that everybody has to go to, right? But then it becomes sort of like having this individual reckoning about your unintentional racism, right? Yes. Here again, we're defining the problem, right? And that definition of the problem, it's not clear that that's the right definition of the problem, right? You know, it's like you don't like you're making it seem like you get it all. And, and also, they talk about painful experiences. We know that you've had painful experiences and whatever. And it's just like, look, it's not about, like, for me, it's never been about pain per se, right? It's like the kind of, like, I remember a story, like, when we were at Carleton eons ago, and we had a friend, Asha Spencer, actually. She's white, she has blonde hair. Asha was always down with the multicultural affairs community. That's what we called it at that time. So she was like, I didn't have a lot of white friends at Carleton, right? Like most of my friends were people of color. We had this like really robust on and popping community. And like, yeah, I was like in CSA and like, you know, we went to a majority white institution, but like our community and our friend group were pretty much people of color, right? And Asha was one of those people who were part of that friend group because she was a part of the multicultural affairs community and she was great, you know, in that regard. But anyway, she went to an event with another good friend of mine, Chua Vu. And I think they were like doing some kind of ice rink thing, you know, skating thing. And the people at the ice rink were treating Chua and her and all the other, you know, sort of brown people really horribly. But Chua didn't notice. Asha noticed, and she was outraged. And it was like, because like when you get treated in a horrible way so regularly, you don't really notice it, you know, unless it's like particularly egregious or it's in a particular thing. So then it's like, you know, it's all around you at all times. So it's not like it's particularly painful. I'm thriving, I'm surviving, I'm cool, you know, like we have a good life. It's not about pain. It's not like, oh, poor you. No, it's about, it's a universal issue. It's a matter of what's my due, what my rights are, what's fair, you fulfilling your mission as an institution and not sort of giving in to white supremacy, which is a form of domination, which is antithetical to democratic equality and freedom. Like, to me, like that's the issue. Like when you allow racism to, you know, sort of proliferate in a community, that community is degraded and undermined, right? Like it's not able to reach lofty goals. It's not able to be as excellent because people are falling back on sort of racial mythologies in order to organize space and relate to people and to consider and think about things. So it's like everybody loses out, you know?
That's exactly it. And I think you bring up really great points about the painful experiences. Because I think about 2 years in a row. So it was my junior year and my senior year. So my junior year, a white Carleton student called out another white Carleton student for specifically calling people of color a very derogatory term, right? And like was just straight up like all the stereotypes that you could think of, he was listing them out. And so that white Carleton student put everything in the clap, like straight up had a whole clap interview thing that went in there and was like, I'm gonna call this person out. And everybody was like, whoa, like that was the first time I ever saw a call out like that. And on top of that, there were all these meetings that occurred afterwards. So there was a rally, there was a few trustees that met with a number of students who helped to organize that clap response. And then after a few months of that was it. Silence. And then the following year, my senior year, another student of color specifically had somebody write a derogatory term on a piece of paper and leave it in their dorm room.
I remember
This
that.
was the thing that got me. In their dorm room, their place of safety, where they live, what they pay to live there while they study. They're not paying for the unnecessary stress. We're not paying for that, right? So in their dorm room, and they are like, I'm gonna host a whole march. I'm gonna march through here. I'm gonna get loud. I'm gonna make it stink. And I was like, go for it. I'm gonna tell you right now, it's not gonna result in anything, baby. And I'm sorry. And he was looking at me like, I don't understand, Halah. Like, you've been so active. You sat in on those meetings last year about what was going on. I was like, right. And it went nowhere. And I'm telling you right now, I'm really sorry. I know this is what you feel like you need to do for yourself to help heal that wound for yourself. But at the same time, that wound is much larger and has many other iterations that have existed even before you. And even that hasn't been addressed. And they will refuse to address it. And that was tough. That was really hard for me to sit in front of this kid and tell him that. I warred with myself many nights. Because I was like, I don't want to sound defeatist, but I do want to sound very realistic, which is why I have so many problems with their response, because it's not realistic. None of this is. It feels like they dancing in theory and don't understand the material. It feels like somehow I'm a caricature. I'm not real. This doesn't seem real to them, that this can actually be acted on when it can. And I think that realm of possibility that often people just associate with blind optimism or optimism, I don't think when it comes to racism, I don't think it's fair to put it that way. I think it's fair to put it in the realm of conversation of this is what I deserve. This is what is just for me to be able to actualize myself as a person. I was telling my manager recently, and I was talking about something that came up in our conversations, the 9 of us, about electives, right? And thinking about the types of electives that are offered at colleges and universities, and that students can elect into any kind of narrative about people of color, but it's not necessarily the required, right? An understanding of people of color, an understanding of their histories is not necessarily required, but you can opt in or opt out of it. And then find yourself in the world operating, right, in different spheres of influence in different arenas with people of color and not have a single understanding. And so, and that brings me to my last point, which is, and then I have Carleton telling me simply about their aspirations, telling me about their mission, telling me about pretty much how they view themselves in the world of being an elite college. I think you definitely have a rigorous program. Your curriculum is rigorous in that sense, but it has a blind spot. It's not reflective of the entire world around. That's problematic. And I can't see you as having an amazing elite curriculum, being an elite school, being top notch. If you are not top notch, doing ways that are top notch to specifically cultivate an environment that is as reflective of the society around, that really prepares us for, hey, by the way, this is what's wrong with society. So you should probably know about this. And maybe here's where you can have a playground to work in that, right?
I mean, I love that you're getting at like one of the possible responses that you would love to see them meditate on, right? And formulate plans for, which might be, how do we build the curriculum so that all students, instead of just taking something that's called intercultural, what is it called? Anita, help me out.
Intercultural requirements, I don't know.
Intercultural domestic studies, I think.
Something,
right?
yeah.
that there actually be a requirement that addresses race, power, and rights, for example, right?
Yeah.
The other thing, though, that you were making me think, Halah, is you're getting at this way in which Ainsley's talking about those painful experiences. And both of you are making me think about Wendy Brown, who is a political theorist. And Ainsley, I'm totally going to get it wrong and then just like slap me a little bit, okay? But Wendy Brown has this theory about like the kind of contentious and problematic way in which identities are built when they're built off of wounded attachments, right? So this idea that when, you know, like my kind of existence as an American, as a Latina American, is always kind of in this state of, you know, being harmed by the body politic, right? That already places me sort of outside of being able to participate in the ways that I want to in the body politic. And what we get here is like this kind of always already kind of insistence by the college that that's where BIPOC students are, right? They are almost always inherently going to have painful experiences, which means that they have this fraught relationship, and they can never be a part of the college in the way that other students can. And what's fascinating too, and I just noticed this when we all were talking about this, they then kind of elide that and talk about that painful time for like apparently everyone. So they're kind of subsuming themselves into that painfulness. And one of the points that Wendy Brown talks about is like, it's just like when we occupy that space, and Ainsley, am I getting it more or less right?
Yes.
Like we can't actually make political change, right? We cannot produce change from that site of pain. What we actually need to do is think about the fracking power that the institution has, right? That they sit with the dollars, the resources, the partners who are willing to help them, the alums who like offered their resources and help in this kind of journey. So I was fascinated to think about like how, you know, they take that pain over there and then kind of like, it's also our pain, isn't it?
And I think what I heard both of you saying, Ainsley and Halah, was kind of this notion of like, where do we locate the damage, right? And what I heard you, Ainsley, saying is that it's not like we're walking around as people of color being damaged and hurt, right? Because we actually have to be resilient. We actually have to like figure this out. Because like you said, both of you have said, right? It's kind of like, it's been like a long-term thing. And I feel like in some ways, like what you're trying to say is that actually the institution is damaged if it's not thinking about all of these things, and if it's not actually providing an education that actually reflects the world that we live in and actually reflects the realities that we're all going to confront, and that we're not actually preparing our students well. So in some ways, it's not about like students of color being damaged or Black students being damaged. It's about sort of the institution being damaged, right? Institution being inadequate, and the institution needing to sort of shift how it thinks about what it's doing, right? And I feel like so it's like easy to say in some ways. It's like, I feel like it's kind of this like, we sort of, in some like training around like, facilitation training, we talk about like how it's a lot easier to like feel, right? Or you think you feel people's pain, but it's a lot harder to like deal with people's like anger. It's a lot harder to deal with like people's like rage, right? And like rightful rage, right? And righteous rage. And like, I think, in some ways, I think it's easy to be like, oh, I'm so sorry you had this terrible experience. Like, let me give you a hug. Let me, send you to like a counselor. And like, I'm not saying like that's bad, but it's like, that's kind of where it stays, right? Because I think that's also another way of individualizing it. It's like, oh, I'm so sorry,
Yes.
Halah, that like you had this experience. And I'm so sorry that, that kid in the dorm had that experience, but it's not seeing this like broader context in which all of those experiences are occurring, right?
God,
The ripple effects.
Yeah.
Go for it though.
I was just going to say, Anita, I think I really loved that moment right there where you highlighted that pain is easier to deal with than anger, right? And I think that's true of both individuals, but it's especially true of institutions, because pain, there are a number of ways in which institutions get used to kind of like patting you on the head and saying, don't worry, we're going to take care of you and your pain, right? But anger is not something you can just pat away. Anger is something that demands restitution, that demands change, and like I would argue large change, structural change. So I think that's a really amazing point about, because the letter wasn't an angry letter, but it was full of righteous anger in that kind of pure sense, right? Of like, please.
Your letter, not this letter.
Yes, your guys' letter.
Yeah.
Sorry. And they don't. It's so funny that I think you're right. They basically took it and they transmuted it into painful experience and pain.
And so I don't know if you have anything more, but I guess I wanted to go down to the part that I feel like both Adriana and I found the most.
This part
was problematic. And I wonder if y'all want to sort of talk a little bit. So part of this is a response to in the alum letter, basically saying that all of you are going to kind of keep from donating or give your hours or give your volunteer hours until sort of Carleton makes a plan, because you don't want to be complicit. So this was sort of a direct response to that part. So do you want to talk a little bit about what you thought about this part?
I do. I think that, so we want to talk about pain and anger. How about shame? So there's a way in which the college is trying to shame alumni for saying that they're going to pull out, which is a means of protest to call for the college's action. And the reason why we're protesting is because we don't like how the college is responding. Right. This letter refuses to acknowledge that at all, right? It refuses to acknowledge that the withdrawal of support is saying we don't want to be a part of we don't like the way you're doing things, fix it, right? So there's not even like, there are so many things that they could have done that would have like kind of shut me up a little bit and would have made me sort of like be open. Could have gotten a few sentence, response saying, we got your letter. We don't want you to think that we're not being attentive to this matter. We're going to take some time and we're going to think about it and we'll be in touch. Like even if they had done something like that, or ask some questions, follow-up questions, like, what I don't see how you don't like get some clarity on what exactly our problem is if they didn't feel like they understood. But that's not what was done, right? Like there's this, and I mean, I think I'm going to speak for myself. I think this letter is arrogant. Mm-hmm. And it's not, and it like we asked in our letter that we be addressed with the regard and respect that we deserve as alumni. This letter does not demonstrate that, right? Like, you're like handling me. You're acting like I don't know what I'm talking about. And I just like, that is blowing my mind, like, I won't even start. I'm not going to start credentializing myself. But I want, so then in line with that, right? Then it's like, oh, you know, we need this money to support the students, et cetera, et cetera. But it's like and then there were people who responded by saying, well, what are like these alumni of color threatening to withdraw their money? They don't give money anyway. They notoriously don't give money anyway, right? That was a response that some people had, not the college per se, but in, you know, the general conversation. And it's like, well, I happen to know someone who does have a lot of money to give to college, but because that money is attached to real ask about thinking around racial justice, the college has refused that money. Okay, number one. Number two, I also know, I hope I'm okay with saying that. I didn't name any names. I also know that, you know, I am struggling financially. Like, even as, and I want, like, even, like, I have an exorbitant amount of debt, along with a lot of the nation, because of the way that this neoliberal system has allowed the banking system to pluck out all of the, you know, basically basic gains that one could get from a college education and have it sort of like put into loans, right? So like we're in this loan sort of like peonage system, like, right? And people of color, especially, who are coming from middle class, lower middle class backgrounds, whatever, wealth inequality is real. You know, I've had to sort of like figure out a way to finance my education on my own. I just am starting to establish myself, right? Like, forgive me if I don't have money to send Carleton right now because I'm trying to get myself together. Forgive me if I can't, like, I don't want to hear about how I could send you $10 when I'm trying to get myself on my feet, right? And then once I get on my feet, there's all kinds of things that maybe I'll be able to do. But let's not act like the situation that the, you know, alumni of color find themselves in, and alumni in general, not just of color, in this world that has the greatest gap in inequality that we have seen since the 1920s, that also is not impacting what goes on in terms of financial giving to the college. And like I said, someone who even had money, right? And also there are ways that people can give and be present in that college besides money, right? I have been present in those ways. I know people who have been present in those ways, right? And the fact that I'm showing up too to have this conversation is a great gift that they're rebuking, because they want to maintain control. They're afraid of democracy. They want to do things top down. They're afraid of the bottom up. You know, they want to maintain control, maintain, you know, sort of like they want to be right, I think, you know. And I think, yeah, I'll stop there. But like, that's a real problem, I think.
Can I pull out a couple of things and then Halah jump in, okay? Just because I want to, like, you know, you gave us a ton, Ainsley, to think about, but like the two important threads that I feel I heard were, one, they use this kind of financial aid language and talking about the needs of current students to shame alums for thinking of their donations to the college not as an individual choice, but as a collective leveraging tactic. So they're basically saying, how dare you join as a collective to think about your monies in this particular way? And then you're pointing out, like, really importantly, that they use this financial language to actually kind of like seal the door on the conversation with y'all by saying, so like, you know, at the very bottom of the letter, they're like, we're grateful for an alumni community who cares enough to criticize. We hope we can count on you to partner with us. But it's after all of this financial data, and there's a way in which that kind of just says, if you can pony up, right? So like the only alum contributions that we really care about are monetary, are financial.
That you're hitting it right on the head. That's pretty much what I got from that too, and a number of alums that actually responded to. That was the main thing that they highlighted. They were like, "So, this is just a ask for more money to support you." And there are two things that come up for me with this. The one being, at the height of COVID-19, where there were students who needed to stay on campus, they asked them to pay a little bit of extra to stay on campus. That's a real thing, okay? And for their reasons that they put out had to do with an increase of staff needing to be there and the labor that's going to happen. We all know there's going to be an increase in that, right? At the same time, why are you asking students to pay extra to be on campus during that time? That's number one. Then you want to tell me that that matters to you here. And then somehow me criticizing you is not considered as a form of support when it is. Those things are not different from each other. Okay. Mm-hmm. I am supporting you by calling you out. I was talking to a friend. I'm gonna put it on a basic level, right? I was talking to a friend and I was like, I'm the type of person that's going to tell you, hey, love, you have something in your teeth. I'm the type of person that's going to do that. We as alums, in a very, very beautiful way, are saying that to you, Carleton. Mm-hmm. You have something in your teeth. You need to get it out. It's not cute. You need to get it right, because how are you showing up in the world? How are you? And how are you expecting your students to show up in the world because of that, right? Mm-hmm. So those are my two things here. You know, and here's the thing that gets me. I worked for the Alumni Annual Fund my entire time at Carleton. Yep. I raised over $100,000 for them in 4 years, the highest record that they have so far as I know. Somebody could probably tell me today, like somebody beat my record last year. Cool, no problem. I don't mind, right? But I did that. You know, I got a $10,000 gift in my senior year to the college. I sat on the Multicultural Alumni Network board. I've given my time, I've given my ideas, I've given money. And what I'm getting at is that, Carleton, you're not worthy of it at this moment. You're not. And that can still exist at the same time as you needing support. So who do you need to reach out to? What funds do you need to go into, baby, to get that support while also doing the work? You can do two of these things at the same time, right? I can eat and read a paper. I did it for all 4 years, right? You know, I wrote a paper and talked smack, right, to my friends, okay? You can do these things at the same time. It doesn't need to be one. And the shaming part is quite sad. It's a low tactic, in my opinion, which is why my biggest thing was try again, right? From this letter, that was my biggest thing, because you're not really trying, you're not remaining grateful with us. You haven't reached out to really speak with us. You haven't done the demand that we asked of you, which was to just meet with us, to have a conversation. No, instead you want to berate me with some statistics about a problem that you're going through right now, and not understanding how those problems, as Ainsley beautifully put together, are related. They're related. The individuals who are suffering the most from COVID-19 are who? BIPOC people. Like, what are we not understanding here? But that goes to the first part of the letter, where we're like, you're talking about a macro and a micro thing. You want to fill in gaps, but you're not understanding that the gaps are part of a larger issue. So all that I've learned from their response is that they're content with the work that they have been doing. They are, and the reason why I say they're content is because at the top of the letter, they specifically highlight the organizations, SETI, MCAN, that they've been working with, right? That they're going to just continue to work with, but did not highlight ever having a conversation with us, the larger community, the alums, right? Even alums, faculty, and staff together, because part of the large part of this work is going to take really challenging the value systems and mission that Carleton has. Its definition of self. We are telling you that it does not include BIPOC. So part of that work is in a defining of self. You can't tell me you're going to welcome someone and you still have a door that's locked, right? You have to come up with a different definition of self that is that the definition, in part, the buy-in for that definition comes from everyone. And it needs to be representative and inclusive of everyone. And so that's part of that work. And that's not going to happen from a board of individuals who they do not represent me. They don't. I don't go to their functions. I don't answer their letters. Many alums don't. So how are they representing me? But I'm giving you a chance to do that. I'm giving you a chance to be at the table and have a conversation with everybody.
Mm-hmm.
Everybody. So you can really learn. Go for it.
And I just wanted to add that, like, you know, I just think about like the financial strains that Carleton is feeling, like in this particular economy as well. As we think about these larger issues around racial justice, anti-racism, you know, any number of ways that we want to sort of put like what it looks like to move away from these things. And that's what the paragraph in the letter that was talking about Carleton thinking about its position in a wider democratic society. Our alumni.
In our
letter.
Yeah.
Oh, yes.
About like how Carleton needs to think about its power and its position within a greater democratic society. And like, if by understanding the problems that they face in realizing, you know, their grander goals or their grander vision for BIPOC students, that then they can think about what role they need to play in outside the world, in organization and in, you know, community with other liberal arts colleges. Think about like their relationship to government, you know, like, you know, the state government, the federal government, all these other things, right? Like, I think that that's what it looks like to make institutional change, for people to think about these sort of regional, local problems and understand the ways that those problems are illustrative of things that are bigger, you know, like instead of talking about individuals as whether they're good people and the kind of biases that they hold and sort of microaggressions that they may be unintentionally, you know, sort of perpetrating, like we need to start thinking about individuals systemically. And I don't think that we know how to do, like, we're not good at doing that. And the way that you think about that is, okay, what do I owe? What are my duties to people, right? Within the sort of greater aims and principles of this organization. What kinds of actions are allowed? What kinds are not? How do we hold people accountable to those things? How do we root out those kinds of behaviors in our community, right? It can't just be like, I have to become a good person and then I'll just be better, as if it's some kind of intuition one just has, as if we're not social beings, we're not political beings, and we're not sort of like cultivated to be certain ways because of the community work, the kind of communities we build and the kinds of relationships that we foster. And institutions have a role to play in that, and they need to act like they need to use their power to do that work, right? Rather than sort of washing their hands and not really owning the level of responsibility that they actually have,
right?
To make good on their promises and their so-called principles and their commitments.
Yeah.
I guess I'm wondering if we could, and you've already done this, both of you, like I'm kind of wondering if we could move towards like, what would you have liked to have seen, or what would you like to see in the future, right? Because I think, Ainsley, you were getting at it, that it's like, and I think actually, Halah, your very first point about like the notion of like urgency versus process, right? And I think sometimes people confuse those things, right? Because I think there's sort of sometimes they're like, well, we get called out when we don't respond right away, and then we do get called out when we do respond right away. I can see people like saying that, right? So kind of thinking about like, what is the, like you can have an urgent response that's also thoughtful. So maybe we can talk a little bit about that. And I think, Ainsley, you were getting at it when you were like, you could have just said, we read it, we want to respond, but we want to sit and listen and reflect for a little bit, right? Whether that would have been like one way to go. And I guess kind of thinking about, you know, what else would you like to see?
You know how you have students, like you say you want an argument-driven paper, and you know, you're like, you didn't really have a thesis here. And they're like, yes, I did have a thesis. And they point it out and they say whatever. And you're like, okay, sure. And then you like, you know, you work towards it and you like try to get them to see. And some students will be like, oh, they understand that they took a guide, right? To try to, they tried to execute on the rules that they were given. And they didn't quite get it. They came to talk to you, and then, you know, they were able to, and then they see that they can get better through a reiterative process, right? Like being a better writer is not just following the initial rules that the professor lays out, but those rules become a guide for the kind of work that needs to be done to get really better. Yeah. Right. And that is like how, like, I think, but then there are students who refuse, who can't see that. And so then they want to like bargain. They want to, but I did this. You said you wanted, and I did that, you know, and you like try to say, but no, you didn't, you know, and you try to do this dance to help them see. And it's just like, I don't like, the sensibility is so off. Right. And like, that's why we ask for a process. That's why we need we need to do bottom up. That's why we need democracy. That's why we need conversations, okay? Because what needs to happen is the cultivation of a common understanding, a common account of the problem, right? Like we're living in different, like we're talking past each other, right? Because we don't see the same phenomenon in the same way. I mean, and actually you don't have to see it in the same way, but it's like, you can't even, it's like reality is elusive for us because we're not even talking about it from various positions to make sure we're seeing the same thing, that we're like trying to address the same kind of problem. That's why it's like, before you can even begin to like build new knowledge, you have to critically reconstruct old knowledge. Yeah. You have to situate yourself in old arguments. And it's like, that's why we need an articulation of the problem. So what did you hear us say, Carleton? What do you hear us say? Not, I'm just gonna use all the different things that everybody, like all these books have said and piece it together, right? But what did you hear us say that's grounded in our community and the way Carleton does things? And
yeah,
what's your take on that? Sorry, I'm finished.
Sorry.
No, please.
I was just going to say that one thing that I loved about your guys' original letter is just that it was so generous in the way that it set out, right? Like, here is, you know, we want this 10-year plan. We want you to take this seriously. We know that's hard. We know that you can't just come up with a 10-year plan right away. So this is just kind of like our opening salvo to start this conversation. And we hope you understand how deeply we care about Carleton. It was generous. It was beautifully crafted. It was rhetorically like a tour de force. And one thing that, like, you know, I think you both are pointing out about this letter, like, Ainsley, I love that you're using the student writer as a metaphor here, is that you get this kind of like cobbled together, wait, I thought we were meeting your points, right? Like, you know, we're talking about racism. We, you know, like, you know, we've got like, you know, things that we already started doing based on this action plan, without actually, as you're pointing out, actually hearing the major ask of your letter, which is simply, can we start this conversation so that we actually agree on what the problems are so that we can look towards the future?
Yes.
That's exactly it.
Yeah.
That's exactly it. One of my favorite lines from a film that I actually enjoy, and it's problematic. Anyway, as good as it gets, is he's like, I'm drowning here, and you're describing the water. That's what happened with this response.
Wow.
And so in terms of what we could have used is, I need you to jump in the water. I'm drowning here. Jump in the water with me. Can you feel the pull? You feel the pull? Can we pull each other up? Wonderful.
Right. Yes.
That's that conversation that Ainsley and Adriana and Anita are talking about that has to happen at the bottom. Let's talk about, are you drowning? You drowning? You feel it too? Cool. I'm glad that we're here now. So now we can figure out, okay, so now that we know that we're drowning and we definitely want to persist and exist, let's start figuring out how the hell we're going to float out this water together. Yeah. Right? Let's do that. Don't describe to me. Don't stand on the sand and tell me, oh man, the water looks like it got you. It looked like a whole monster. Man, that seems painful.
And good communities are not afraid of democracy, of democratic, open conversation. Yes, it can get crazy. You know, just because you bring people to the table doesn't mean there are some crazy ones in the bunch, you know? But like but you have to, like, and that it won't get unwieldy and that people won't go all over the place, right? But like, that's the cost you have to pay, right? In order to get to the sort of like beneficial stuff that comes from sort of like the exchange of ideas, right? And that's, you know, the sort of practice of considering and thinking about these things, and having opinion formation, and like the exchange of ideas, and getting clear about the different sort of positions that we see people coalescing around, and how we might compromise, how we might sort of like use the ways that we currently address things and tweak them, or, you know, or like bring in something altogether different, or that we might actually need to think about the governance structure of, you know, committees differently, or we might, you know, there are people that need to be a part of this conversation that are always excluded from this conversation, or this person needs more power in their role in order to do their work, because the way that it's currently structured, these people over here can just use their arbitrary will to shut down, you know, whatever they want to shut down. And that's not the kind of institutional structure that we need in order to do the kind of work that we need. Like, these are practical problems that we can actually solve if we can get grounded in sort of like the actual, you know, operations of the college, the actual sort of like, you know, ways that things are operating there, the kind of culture of Carleton. And I just want to say this quickly too, like the school that I was at before, I would always try not to be too negative, but I would always think back to Carleton as my foil against that place. And every time I would kind of have a problem with the place I was, they would say something like, well, you went to the University of Chicago, that's an R1. And I was like, oh no, baby, I went to Carleton College, right? And the culture, the intellectual culture there is amazing. Like like Carleton is a good, and we also make the distinction between Carleton, the institution, and Carleton, the community,
yes.
Right? Like, that's why we can even have this conversation. That's why we're even like, you know, like the professors that I studied under, a lot of them, like Nancy Cho's playwright of color class, playwrights of color changed my life. Like, to this day, I think about that class when I think about race. Yeah. You know, like, there are people like Bill North is the one, I mean, I could shake my hand at him, who got me off the track from being a lawyer to being a professor. Like, he's responsible for that, and all the great work he does. And I could go, Adriana, you do like all this stuff, like all these amazing people at Carleton, right?
Nice.
And people who are not there anymore, who had such a tremendous impact in producing and cultivating who I am. Like, there's good stuff going on there, but it's really bad when you have institutional structures that won't allow that good stuff to lead, won't allow that good stuff to sort of like proliferate and become the thing that, you know, sort of determines and shapes the community, you know? And that's the concern right now, that good stuff is getting lost in this defensive, you know, kind of blind spot kind of stuff. And there's no need for that. They have the resources, they have the people they need to do the work. So let's do it.
Yeah. And it's almost, it feels at times as though they don't trust. I think about a coworker of mine who worked at a company that would specifically record everyone's 101s, which is weird, right? Why would you do that? That's a CYA kind of thing. It's extremely defensive, right? You're like, I want to make sure that whatever happens, we have enough evidence to support whatever agenda that we want to put forth. And it's like, Carleton, I am not your enemy. I have never been your enemy. I come from you, right? You helped shape me into the thoughtful citizen that I am today, right? Adriana knows this. At one point in time, I thought about leaving Carleton. I had an extensive conversation with her, almost 2 hours long. Thank you. I love you for that. And when she said, I really don't think your journey at Carleton is over, Halah. Carleton needs you as much as you need Carleton. That stuck with me because I recognized two things. I have some growing to do. I'm not finished yet. and neither is Carleton. And my place here should be able to help activate, catalyze, and promote growth there. And we should be able to do that as alums on the outside. Faculty and staff should be able to do that on the inside, and we should all feel safe in doing that. There should be a common understanding of trust. It's from a place of love. You said it, Ainsley. I cannot tell you, there's so many people at Carleton who have helped to shape me, that have called me out, that said, sister girl, you don't understand, okay? Jill Scott voiced me, okay? And who deserve to be speakers of the college, who deserve to feel like not just their practice is enough, that their work there is beyond just the role, right? That's all I got to say about it.
I think
I love that.
a really powerful place to end the conversation.
Yeah. Thank you both so
much. I can't thank you both enough. This has been so amazing.
No, this is great. And thank you for giving us a space to break it down.
Yeah, no, I mean, we kind of were interested in it, but then we're like, well, we're not actually in some ways the people being addressed in this letter, right? Because I think it's also like, we're faculty and we have a particular relationship to the institution, but it's not as alums.